welcome to the City Rev Life podcast. My name is Justin. I'm sitting here with Pastor Robey, and we are continuing our conversation about how to survive a political season with your soul intact. And we're having a really, what I think is going to be a really interesting, helpful conversation in this episode. So, Pastor Robey, maybe give us just the quick bullet points of where we've been and kind of what's really this whole series about.
Yep. So the series is not about the details of this particular political cycle that we're in, but more so it's not specifically about the politics, the issues, the candidates. Mm-hmm. It is more about how do we shepherd our souls during a political cycle. And this is just coming from the last several years. At the end of a political cycle, people find themselves disoriented or discouraged, fried, anxious, broken relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's on when they felt like their candidate won, and that's been at times when they felt like their candidate lost. So it's not, those are not just tied to whether someone's political party or candidate wins. It's just the political cycle can really take a toll on someone's faith and especially on our mission as believers. We have a mission that Jesus commanded us to do. It's not optional. And so a lot of times politics can overtake our lives, including our mission.
Yeah, we've talked about how politics has swallowed up so much in our culture. Yes. And that same temptation comes with, it wants to swallow up faith, matters of faith. And spiritual lives. And so some of the key things we've talked about is specifically politics makes a really good idol. Mm-hmm. And it's just a lot of the things that make an idol in someone's life. A lot of those things can be very easily associated with politics. So we have to be watchful that politics do not become an idol in our lives. It's also important to make sure that we're starting with a biblical framework and letting that influence our politics rather than starting with a political framework and backing into politics. Mm-hmm. And backing into the scripture.
I'm sorry, starting with a political framework and backing into scripture. That's right. Yep. So just making sure that, and some things to watch for to make sure that that's not happening. So some of those things are some of the key things that have been guiding our discussion.
Awesome. So today what we're going to talk about is we've had this conversation, and I love the metaphor you use to describe it. So maybe just give us the metaphor for the topic that we're talking about and how it plays into some of what people feel the pressure to be or become when it comes to the politics conversation.
Absolutely. So a key part of our spiritual health is being active on our mission. Our mission was given to us by Jesus to go into all the world and make disciples. And the way it's said in Acts chapter 1 is we are to be his witnesses to the ends of the earth. And so core to our spiritual health is bearing fruit for him. And so this part of guarding our souls in a political season has to do with our mission. And it's really recognizing a shift in our culture in the times that we live in. And I think probably one of the biggest influencers for this shift is the rise of social media. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that everyone has, various platforms call them followers. We call it platforms. And so there's now everyone has followers and platforms, and it's really friends and maybe people that we're loosely connected to.
For the majority of people.
For the majority of people. Now, there are some people that have a legitimate social media platform and they're influencers in that capacity. Mm-hmm. But for most of us, it's a way to just socially connect. However, it has created this dynamic where we are kind of adopting the same voice and tone as a social or political activist. And so we've been using the metaphor of the Uberization of social activism, which is, Uberization is, there was once an industry of taxis
right? You'd have to make the phone call.
Yeah.
In Broward down here, I think it was like, 954-777-7777. Okay.
Exactly.
Not anymore. You don't have to do that anymore.
You'd call a cab. There's an industry, and then Uber came along, Lyft, some of these others, where now anyone can drive someone around in their car.
All you need is a phone in your pocket, and you can you're a taxi driver.
Right. It's no longer exclusive to an industry. It is now anyone can be a provider, so to speak. So that dynamic, and that's happened in multiple industries. I think about Airbnb and others and stuff like that. So that's the Uberization. Well, that I believe in a lot of ways has happened to the idea of social or political activism. There was a season where there was an era, and probably for most of history, there was an era where there was a group of influencers. They were political candidates, or there were a couple commentators, they were authors, and people would listen to them, support them in various ways, follow them, but they themselves didn't see themselves as a political or social activist. They didn't talk like one, speak like one. And I think in that era, then there was more openness to dialogue. You could sit down, if you're a Democrat, you could sit down with a Republican. If you're a Republican, you could sit down with a Democrat. You could disagree. You could talk about those things. And now we're still humans and disagreement's hard. But I think with the advent of people all feeling like they are now an activist with a platform and they have to speak like an activist, one of the consequences is we've not been able to disagree human to human anymore because we talk a certain way publicly.
Yeah, and we disagree in this case mostly online.
Right.
Where we're arguing with our thumbs, back and forth with people that we're not able to converse with in many cases.
And part of the problem is we say things in a way and with words online we would never do interpersonally.
Sure.
Because you feel like this separation, but it's still the same person on the other side. And so sometimes we can say things more strongly, more ugly online than we would in person.
So the Uberization of social activism,
yes,
it's this idea that now anybody, you too, can be a social activist.
Yes.
And there's almost this pressure because there's this wave of people who are taking to their social media platforms and they're speaking in these ways.
Yes.
So do you feel the pressure? Well, I need to
right.
respond in this way. And so what are some of the challenges with that? What are some of the pitfalls with when we maybe bite off more than we can or should chew in terms of our social activism online? What are some of the pitfalls we just need to be watchful over?
So I think there's really two main ones. And I think the first one has to do with what you said, is that there's this pressure and there's this expectation that we are to all post in the same way and all use social media in that same way. And so especially when the political engine gets going, or the cultural engine gets going because of some incident in society, there is this expectation that if you are going to be a Christian that's engaging culture, you will use your social media in a certain way, and that certain way is to be a commentator. So you're to be a commentator on politics, a commentator on something culturally, something socially, and so you're going to use it with that same voice. It's very authoritative. It can be sometimes very aggressive. It's getting those. So then those issues and your stance on those issues are what come out first. They're like some of the first things that someone can know about me online because I'm posting all of those things out if I'm doing that.
Right.
And so the challenge is there's this pressure to do that, and a lot of times Christians can feel like, oh, like if I don't post about politics, or if I don't step in and debate that person on social media, then I'm failing to engage culture as a Christian. And Christians can even feel or be made to feel like they're not being missional because they're not on mission because they didn't post. And so there's this pressure to post. And when maybe that's not the wise course of action. Maybe the wise course of action is to be silent. Maybe the wise course of action is to use your social media for completely other purposes. And so that's not always the wise thing, but there's this pressure because everyone's a social activist now, so to speak. There's this pressure that's the only way to use that social media presence. And that's not always wise.
So having that question to say, wait a minute, is this a time when I need to be a person who speaks into this thing happening? And sometimes maybe the answer is yes. Maybe if something hits close to home, we've had tragedies hit here locally, and we want to use our influence, sure, but this pressure to be some expert commentator on the issues at hand. Something we need to be watchful for and don't feel like. What's the second pitfall you'd say?
So before we get to the second one, I think the other part of that is when I feel that pressure to be a social activist, there are other uses to, let's just dig in on that. I'm also going to miss opportunities for other uses for social media. And so if I feel the pressure to be a social activist, then I miss an opportunity to, when we talked about this in previous episodes in this series, what is the thing I am first and foremost evangelizing? And to the Corinthians, Paul said, I came to you with that which is of first importance. Like there is a priority order, and it is the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, the gospel does come to bear on all areas of life, but there is a priority order. I am called to reach souls with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And in fact, in one place, Paul says, I knew nothing else among you. And so like if my social media post is buried with all of this, all these other posts, and I'm never looking for an opportunity to share the gospel or to say something that's going to point someone to something towards Jesus, like I'm missing an opportunity. So that pressure to use my social media influence and my social media presence for a social or political platform is big. And there are people out there that will tell Christians, if you are not being aggressive on social media politically and culturally, you are failing as a believer. And that is just not, that is out of priority order. There are times to post, but we have to be wise because we actually have a greater priority. And there are times, many times, that I am going to avoid something culturally or politically because I want to have an opportunity to share the clear, clean gospel of Jesus Christ. And so that the first problem is that pressure to use social media as a political or cultural commentator.
That's helpful. So get to the second. What would you say is the second thing we need to be watchful for?
Sure. The second one is then we're missing actually what our primary calling is. Our primary calling is, especially interpersonally, we are to be an army of good Samaritans. We are to be an army of people that person to person are demonstrating and communicating the gospel. We're to be people that are showing love. And so there's this dynamic with this Uberization of social activism and the rise of social media and things like YouTube, where we're enamored by the momentary notice of the masses rather than the deep impact on one's soul. So if we post something on TikTok and it gets 100,000 views, we look at that as a success, rather than if I sit down and have one really meaningful lunch with a coworker that maybe doesn't know Jesus. Like the impact of those two is not even comparable. Like 1 hour or an hour and a half sitting with a coworker that doesn't know Jesus and having a loving presence and even getting a chance to share the gospel, that is planting gospel seeds. Whereas the momentary notice by 100,000 people that they see a video 1 minute and the next minute they've completely forgotten because they're on to the next video or the next post that's seen by thousands, like those are not even comparable. And so we lose the impact of the one, the deep impact of the one, because we're enamored by the momentary notice of the masses. And so what we're called to be is an army of people. If I just think of our context, our city, if the Church of South Florida, the tens of thousands of believers in South Florida committed themselves to having the deep impact of a few and saw the incredible eternal impact they could have on a handful of people around them, their neighbors, their coworkers, their family members. And if they weren't enamored away saying that wasn't thinking that wasn't a legitimate, deep, eternal impact, if everyone recaptured that vision of what it would mean to have the deep impact on the handful of people they have influence around them, then that's how deep cultural, social, spiritual change can happen. And so sometimes and here's the tension, if I am in social activism mode, perpetually on social media, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to limit the type of relationships I have, and it's going to make it so really the people that I'm going to have relationships with are the people who think exactly like me. Because if I'm speaking in a very aggressive, even angry, combative tone of that kind of activist, I'm not creating healthy dialogue with people around me. And as a believer, it is so important for me to have all kinds of relationships with people who think differently than I do, so that I can have an influence primarily for the gospel. And so if I'm in that activism mode, I'm going to be pushing those relationships away, and I'm only going to have deep, meaningful, lasting, thorough relationships with people that think exactly like me.
Yeah, and that makes me think of two things that come along with that. The first is social media itself is designed to bunch us with people and accounts that post similar ideas, similar videos. So that isolation, you're saying, the algorithms themselves are going to funnel to us people who are thinking the same exact way, along the same lines, further isolating ourselves from the people that we want to be in dialogue with.
Yes.
And if our goal is to ultimately influence people towards Christ, we want to be able to have relationship with people who think differently. We want to be friends of sinners and be able to point them to Jesus. And so that's the first thing that makes me think of it. And the second is this idea of social activism online. I think the tendency also is sometimes that then excuses us from it makes us feel like, well, see, I made a difference. I posted this. I did my job. And there is value in, when it's something that's truthful, you're standing for biblical truth. There's tremendous value in standing for biblical truth in a statement. That's not, immaterial. But where the rubber meets the road is the person, your neighbor, your coworker, that it's not just a statement they need. They need you in their life being the presence of Christ and introducing them to who God is so that they might know him. And sometimes posting can make us feel like we've done our duty, and therefore we have no work left to do.
Right. We feel like the hard work is we're a social media warrior. Well, maybe the hard work is inviting your neighbor over for dinner, and like having a barbecue in your backyard and having your neighbors over, and in the hard work of actually having authentic, sometimes messy relationship. That's the work. When we like, Jesus, what is the work you want us to do? That was the work. It was, who is the soul? I think of the Good Samaritan. He was asked, how do I love my neighbor? The political engine will tell you, here's how you love your neighbor. You speak truth to them. Well, like, there is a time and a place for that. Not everyone is called to be a social activist, but there is a time and a place for speaking truth in love and gentleness. But when Jesus was asked, how do I love my neighbor? It's the person that God has allowed to be put in our path, and we give of themselves. We don't just lecture them. We don't convince them. We're not arguing with them. We're giving of ourselves in love to that person. Especially the case that he gave was a Samaritan to a Jewish person. They were different politically, spiritually, socially. I mean, they were diametrically opposed. And when Jesus was asked, what does it look like to love your neighbor, which he said was the second most important commandment that flows right out of the first commandment of loving God. What does it look like? The commandment that these two commandments sum up all the law, love God and love others. What does it look like to love others? It is giving of yourself to someone God has placed in your path that looks very, very different from you.
Yeah.
And so if there's a lot of times when a social activism presence on social media will actually make it much harder, if not impossible, to do that.
Yeah.
And so I want to keep prioritized on my mission, what I'm evangelizing, and I'm going to be very thoughtful when and if I post on things that are secondary in their priority to the gospel, because I want to be I want to be part of the army that's loving the individuals around me. I don't want to miss out on the value of impacting one soul for eternity.
That's good. And it reminds me of that story of Jesus at Simon the Pharisee's house, and the Pharisee's thinking to himself, as this woman is there weeping at Jesus' feet, if this man knew who was, there at his feet, he would not let her touch him.
Yeah.
And Jesus launches into this whole parable about whoever's been forgiven much loves much. And we want to have that kind of impact in people's lives who are far from God, whose lives are broken. We want to see people like Jesus did. He looks at the crowds and he sees them with compassion as sheep without a shepherd. And that means that we give the truth. It's not backing down on the truth, but it means that it's done in love with grace and pointing people to Christ.
And making sure the truth is prioritized.
Yeah.
We give them the truth, but the most important truth is the gospel of Jesus.
Yes. Yeah.
And we cannot let anything else take priority over that.
Yeah. And you know, what's so important to remind us is like the gospel has an offense in and of itself. It confronts us. We are all sinners. And so we don't want to put stumbling blocks unnecessarily in front of people before we bring them to Jesus. The primary thing they have to wrestle with, they are a sinner in need of God's salvation. And so we want to present to them the wonderful Savior who loves them still, and have conversations with them first and foremost about him and what he says about the way to life and the way to the Father. Any closing thoughts just before we wrap this episode up?
No, I think the last thing is just again to emphasize God has placed, for those believers listening, God has placed someone already in your path. I think we can just assume and expect that. And so how can you show love to them? How can you show love to them today? That is engaging the culture around you, engaging the city around you. And what can you do? And if you have a social media presence, how can you take a risk and not spend the risky post on culture or politics, but could you spend it on the gospel? Is there a post that you could put out there that shows the beauty and grace and truth of the gospel of Jesus? What if more of us did that more actively? That's
good. And so we hope that this conversation has been clarifying, has been helpful to you. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the City Rev Life podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life podcast. Feel free to subscribe or leave a rate and review. If you want more content or additional resources, head to cityrev.org or download our app. We hope you have a great day.